Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Today I have a guest, Angela Foster, joining us today. She is an award-winning nutritionist, health and performance coach, speaker, and host of her own podcast, the High Performance Health Podcast. And she is a former corporate lawyer that turned into an industry leader in the biohacking and health optimization space for women. She's been featured on so many different publications between the HuffPost, Runner's World, the Health Optimization Summit, Brain Tap, and she is incredible with the work that she does. And I'm super stoked about today's podcast because I've been actually wanting to bring somebody on to talk a little bit more about chronic fatigue syndrome, burnout, because it's something that we all struggle with, or I'd say most people struggle with our never-ending to-dos lists and just so many things that we have going on in our life. And I know myself, I've even struggled a bit with burnout, being an entrepreneur and being very type A and a go-getter in my life. And it's definitely frustrating when you have these goals, you have these dreams, you have these visions, but you feel like you can't keep up with your dreams and your visions and the things that you want to do. So she's an expert on all things high performance. So we're going to be diving into that, which I know I'm going to definitely take advantage of while she's on the show here today. But I'm super stoked to bring her on. Angela, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Rachel, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So I want to start with your story here because I'm fascinated that you were a corporate lawyer and have transitioned to the health and the wellness space, specifically on health optimization. I actually dated a lawyer for about 5 years. So I feel like I understand a bit of like what work entails. And I mean, his entire life was revolving around his work and everything that he was done. So I know firsthand, what that really entails, but I'm curious of that transition and also your story with burnout and how it brought you into doing the work that you do. Because even for myself, like a lot of the work that I do, it has come from my own pain and my own healing story and the things that I've had to walk through. And I think that's just something that's so powerful from coaches of when they've had some kind of a real life experience, some kind of a pain that they had to really heal through, learn through. And as a byproduct, they were able to become an expert in that thing. So you're an expert because you walked through it, but take me back a little bit. Take me back to your story and what led you to do what you do.
Yeah. So if you were dating a lawyer, you'll know what it's like, right? It's so unpredictable. Yeah. That's the thing. And I think I really sympathize because I know for my husband, it was really difficult many times. And it's so easy. I was in like corporate law. So you can end up working all nights, like pulling off successive nights in a row, weekends, anything really to get a deal done, particularly when you're working multinationally across time zones like I was. And I think that really set the stage for the burnout that was to come. At that point, to be honest, I think most of us in our 20s, we feel pretty invincible, like we can take on anything. And that's certainly how I felt. And then in my late 20s, I had some challenges around my hormonal health with PCOS and endometriosis. And it was around the time that I was thinking of starting a family. So there were a few challenges there, but then I was very fortunate to go on and have 3 children, albeit very quickly in sort of the space of 4.5 years. And I made partnership at the law firm when my eldest was 8, when I was 8 months pregnant with my eldest. So it was kind of a lot going on together. I tried for a natural delivery. That was always the plan, but I had pelvic disproportion. So that ended up being an emergency C-section. And the other 2 were also born by C-section. And I think that put a big strain on my body. Obviously, there were 3 pregnancies close together. I'd been working very hard. As a lawyer, I exercised. I always exercised a lot and ate reasonably healthy, but I wasn't kind of into health optimization in the way that I am now. But I think the part I was unprepared for was the fact that I suffered with postnatal depression. And that took a lot to come to terms with. I think I was in denial for quite some time with my first and then my second child. But it got progressively worse. And that's when, after my third child, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And at this point, things had kind of gone so bad that I really felt like I didn't have or didn't deserve a place in my family's life, and that they would be better without me. So I was in this sort of situation where I was wrestling with myself, trying to run away from myself. And I'd kind of created a prison in my own mind. So I just wanted to turn the thoughts off in my head, but I didn't want to leave my kids without a mother. So I didn't know what to do. And then the kids got flu. I picked it up and suffered with pneumonia. And that's when I think my immune system was so low because of the mental health issues, the physical health, the burnout. And I ended up being hospitalized with bilateral pneumonia, both viral and bacterial. And that was a kind of very urgent rush into hospital, and a brush with my life that left me kind of really taking a relook at things. After that experience, I felt so lucky to still be alive. And it changed my perception. And that was really the beginning of my journey to ending up where I am today.
Yeah. So getting sick was the big pivotal moment for you.
It was. Yeah. And I think it was surprising because I tried to run away from myself so much, and like physically running as well. Running was one of the things I would do. I was on a lot of medication. I was having bipolar episodes, which I think was probably the cruelest part, because the lows were then preceded by these highs, and that almost kind of put so much contrast around it. And I was really struggling. And I thought that, having tried to run away from myself, it was surprising when I was in hospital that I felt this profound sense of peace and connection. And this feeling where, the universe here was offering me a way out, almost, it seemed. And I realized I was okay being me. And that was really the pivotal moment for me.
You said I was okay being me. What do you mean by that?
I think for anyone listening who has struggled with clinical depression, there's just so much self-loathing.
Yeah.
And your confidence is on such a low ebb that I hated myself. I thought I was a terrible mother. It feels, I suppose, irrational in a way now, but that was the state that I was in at that point.
Yeah. It's almost a lot of self-rejection. And I can imagine too, at least with Western medicine here, it's very much shame-based often, right? And even given labels of, okay, you have major depressive disorder, and we take on those labels of, okay, there's something wrong with me. And then we treat it with medication, which something I speak to is I'm never against medication. It can save so many people's lives when they're in very low moments of their life. And sometimes we need the medication. But I know for a lot of people, when they are given a label, something like you have this wrong with you, or they're given medication to manage the symptoms, it can almost feel like I can't really heal from this. All I have to do now is manage the symptoms with this medications. It's really dealing and not really truly healing, and not really getting to some of like the core root causes of what led to a lot of the depression that you were speaking to. So that's one of the things I have a big problem with our system, at least, is I feel like the labels and the medication and being the only core focus of treatment can actually be very, very detrimental for somebody's mental health, because we stop really looking for answers and trying to really heal. Do you feel like that was happening for you?
Yeah, I think that was definitely happening. And I think that because medication, the answer is often medication, as you say. And then I was prescribed, initially antidepressants, which I hadn't wanted to take. And then it enabled me to do some work on myself. So I would say, like you were saying, I think medication can be really helpful, but it's not going to solve the problem. So then I was able to do CBT, but I found that, the medication the third time around didn't work. So that's when I got referred to one of the mental health hospitals here, and I was under psychiatric care looking at different antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication alongside antipsychotic medication, which was to control those bipolar episodes and really just to kind of stabilize me. And it worked. It did get me stable. But you get to a point where you can't really feel anything because you're so numb with the meds.
Yeah. So you got to this point where, you're managing it, you're more stable, you get sick, you have this big awakening moment of, you know what, I actually accept myself. which is a really powerful place to get to in our healing journey. What do you feel like allowed you to step into your healing after that? Where did this evolve to?
Think like what was lucky for me, I think when I was in the hospital, I felt like when my kids came to see me and they were really young, they just loved me unconditionally. And that was probably what gave me and my husband, that gave me the kind of, I guess, that sense of autonomy within, that there was something bigger than me and I could get through this. And so I felt like I want to make a difference to them. And so initially it started as, I guess, what you would describe quite a selfish journey of how can I get really well? And I looked at it and I was like, right, I'm physically, mentally, and spiritually broken at this point on all three levels. How can I put myself back together? And interestingly, we were talking offline around functional medicine and what you do and the power of it. And that was actually the first place I went to. I went to a functional medicine doctor because I was like, I'm done with all the antibiotics. You know, my gut health was destroyed after all the intravenous antibiotics and everything, and the retreatment I'd received. And so I'd had all this antidepressant, antipsychotic medication. I was told I would be on that for life. And at that point, I was just accepting of taking the medication, but I wanted to understand how can I get well. And that's when I turned to functional medicine, did some testing and really started to explore. But it was when I got into as well, the mind-body connection and the power of that. I remember reading at that point, Dr. Joe Dispenza's book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And I realized that I literally had to break the habit of being myself. But that's a journey in itself and takes time.
It's so funny. That book was incredibly pivotal for me in my life. And I love that you mentioned that because actually I created my entire business from reading that book. And I feel like that actually helped me get through a lot of my own roadblocks and limiting beliefs, not so much on healing my gut with a lot of my core health issues, but a lot of my deep internal wounds and really actually taking ownership of where I was relating to myself from or the relationship I had with myself. So I perked up a little bit there because I got excited. I was like, wow, I actually had a life-changing experience with that book too, but it's true. It's really the habit of how we've been showing up in our life that we get to or need to sometimes break in order to step into the versions of ourselves that we want to become. So you did all of this testing. So you went to a functional medicine practitioner. They did testing. You started to step into the mind-body connection. Were you aware at this point that you were in a burnout and what was contributing to all of that? Or were you still kind of looking for answers at this point?
I think at that point I was just fully focused on like, how can I get well? Like I was aware I was burnt out. I started as I was speaking to different practitioners before I kind of retrained myself, putting the pieces together and understanding that, it wasn't just kind of bad luck that I suffered with postnatal depression, that there were pieces along the way, pieces of the puzzle that was leading up to it. So for example, I realized that, pregnancy depletes a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, and having 3 children in such a short space of time would have contributed to that. And I wasn't consciously like, I did during pregnancy, take pregnancy vitamins, but afterwards I was kind of like, oh, I'll just be fine. My days as a corporate lawyer meant that because I'd pulled off however many all-nighters, if my babies weren't sleeping, which they weren't because they had really bad reflux, I didn't really nap during the day. I was that typical type A personality of just keeping going. And so I started to understand that all of these things individually, even when I later released the podcast, and a couple of years ago, I spoke to Dr. Sarah E. Hill, who wrote the book, Your Brain on Birth Control, and her work's transformational. And I realized just how much, when the PCOS wasn't even investigated and when I was a teenager and I was just put on the pill so early and never had natural menstrual cycle, just how much that had contributed and maybe changed my brain. So I started to realize that it wasn't an accident, right? These things had slowly, bit by bit, contributed to that fall that happened ultimately.
Yeah, it's often this perfect whirlwind, right? Of it's not one thing, and something that we speak to a lot is it's typically what are the root causes, plural. Like we're often looking for that one thing. It's my gut, I have SIBO, or it's my hormones, but most of the time there's an accumulation of things that are off internally. And I'm sure you found that if you went through functional medicine testing, you were probably like, all right, I have this off with my gut, and then my adrenals here, and then there's this with my hormones, and then I'm deficient in these things. And it's like, what is the root cause? Well, it was the combination of, how I was working, and not really allowing myself to have margin. I know for myself, like that's what led to my own burnout, but zero margin in the day, not proper recovery, maybe not having nutrition of where it needed to be to support having a new baby. And it's a combination. Sometimes we're exposed to different things, but it's like this perfect whirlwind that causes dis-ease to begin to occur in the body. And then taking that functional approach is asking the question, what is off, but why is it off? And when we get to the core root of this, it's all of these different things. So what were some of the core things that you found? I know you mentioned omega-3 fatty acids, but it sounds like there was a big awakening with lifestyle for you and how you were working and how you were showing up. And it sounds like there was even like a spiritual and a mental component to that too.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that spiritual component often gets kind of, underestimated really in its potential. I think that I sort of moved away from, because I've been brought up as a very strict Catholic family. I kind of have moved away because that's how I'd had sort of God and things like that sort of defined to me, and it didn't resonate with me. So I felt like detached, right? So I'd had this physical burnout. My mental health was on the floor. I didn't want to live at that point. And spiritually, I wasn't feeling a connection. That connection when I was at the hospital, that I felt that really strong sense of love for my children and husband, is what allowed me to evolve. And I think for anyone listening, if you look up Hawkins' map of consciousness and you see the vibrations, the vibrations of peace, love, and joy, which is what I felt in hospital, are so powerful that those are the emotions and vibrations that can really signal your genes in new ways, which is what Dr. Joe Dispenza and Dr. Bruce Lipton talk about. And so it wasn't easy when I came out of hospital, because the thing is, when you have a revelation like that, you still got to maintain it, right? You've still got to maintain your mental health when you come out. And that was what took a lot of work, a lot of kind of dismantling myself, my attachment. I wasn't working then. I was really working on myself, and detaching, I guess, to a degree, the ego, right? I was this successful person. And I remember sitting with a therapist, and it used to take, I feel so bad about this now, that, it would take my 4-year-old son an hour and a half to sort of drag mummy out of bed in the morning and for me to get him to school. And that just feels a horrible place now that I was in. But I remember having a conversation with my therapist and her saying to me, maybe you're doing too much, Angela. And it's like, how can I be doing too much? Like, the school run is considered an achievement. And I used to be running these multinational deals. So I had to kind of get there in my head of just accepting that I was on this journey and I was going to have to give myself some grace and some time to really get back on track.
Yeah. How did you begin to get back on track? Right. So you're in this place of, it sounds like burnout and fatigue. And for a lot of people, like they are sometimes even given the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, when they're in this place where normal tasks, like you're speaking to, like, I'm just taking my kid to school. Like, this isn't too much. I'm just trying to do normal daily activities, but it feels like a weight and a burden to just like get through these things. Right. And I think that's where a lot of people fall into. Right. And I know for myself, like I've experienced that 100%. So I can connect to and relate to this story. But what were some of the things that you began to do to help get your energy back and help shift that?
So I really focused hard on nutrition and making sure that I was fueling my body in a better way. I was taking, I'd done some testing. I was taking some supplements to help kind of support everything I was doing nutritionally. Exercise wise, I took a lot more seriously and, started seeing a trainer to help me kind of order things, because again, that type A personality in me, when I got into it, would want to go too far. And then that just leads to less recovery, and you don't really get the adaptations, and you just feel more burnt out again. I think that has always been a challenge for me, because I think there's almost an over-reliance, I want to say, on exercise a little bit, because it really is so powerful in terms of mental health, which I think is a good thing. But then when you do rely, and I know you're like big on exercise as well, you have to really balance that, don't you? Because it's quite addictive in its own right, but it also puts a lot of strain on the body. So you've got to have enough recovery. So that's something I've kind of had to navigate as I've gone along the way as well. And then I got into like the biohacking space and started looking at other modalities, that enhance mitochondrial health. So things like red light therapy and infrared sauna and different things that I was trying, meditations, and really getting in touch with myself from a spiritual perspective, and making that connection, which again, at first was hard. I didn't have the capacity to kind of sit with myself for very long, but over time, if you make a commitment, it begins to come.
Yeah. I think what's so difficult sometimes with making some of these shifts and changes, right, is like we view exercise as always good 100% of the time, but we don't take into account the place in which we're coming from very often. And how I describe this is, right, sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself and your body is to make yourself go to the gym, and you don't feel like that. And that was a good decision when after you feel energized, right? You're like, okay, I'm so glad I went. I feel amazing after. I have energy now, where you've maybe felt a little bit run down and fatigued, but you just needed to get your booty off the couch and get in the gym. And then there's other times where we have the thoughts of going to work out and moving our body. And if we are to push ourselves to go, and we notice that we feel worse after, we feel more fatigued and run down, we have to ask ourselves that question of where were we really coming from at the beginning? Was this coming from a place of, hey, we got this, let's get off our butt, we're going to feel better after? Or was this coming from a place of, you have to go do this? And I love that. And what it's sounding like is you got very in touch with yourself. And I think that's what a lot of people are missing, is they're missing that intuition that we have of like, okay, I need to rest today. My body is asking for rest. And if I go try to push myself and I do all of these things, it's going to actually put me in a worse place, versus the days where we're like, okay, I feel like a little bit tired, but I know by acting in spite of these feelings and emotions, it's going to actually allow me to feel better. So I know a lot of my own journey has been really learning to tap into knowing the difference between those two, which from a practitioner standpoint, it's not that easy, because you can't just say to your client, hey, go work out 5 times per week, do this, and follow it as an equation of as if it's black and white. It really has to come down to, hey, are you listening to your body and what is really going to be the best things? Because often what also gets us into the rut in the first place with burnout is we're not really listening to that inner voice of, hey, you need to slow down, you need to rest, because the type A part of our brain comes out and is like, nope, you still need to do all of these things. You have too much to do. You can't really listen to that. For me, really understanding even my cycle, which you don't get to really tap into, what I feel like is a feminine superpower when we're on birth control. And you spoke to being on birth control, but there's different times in the month where we actually need to slow down as women. Like we need to listen to that, because we're more likely to experience burnout. And then there's times during the month where, we can kind of push ourselves a little bit more, but only you, for everyone's listening, only you can really know the difference of when you're pushing yourself too far and when you need to give yourself some grace and rest.
That's so true. So true. And I had to kind of navigate that and work it out. And I think one of the things, it's just really interesting because it was a long journey. And then when I started the podcast and I started interviewing experts, that gave me access to even upgrade my thinking further, because many of the people's material I was reading or studying, I was then interviewing and getting closer to it. But I still it still took time. I mean, it was like 2019, end of 2019. So just before COVID struck, before I transitioned fully off all medication. Like that, even just like coming off the medication because I was on so much was a journey in itself. And then, and you experience when you reduce antipsychotic or antidepressant medication, and I did them separately. When I was coming off them, you experience, unfortunately, rebound symptoms of depression because it's withdrawal, as you know. So it's like, it's a different, but the awareness that I had that this wasn't me anymore. I'd done the work. I'd moved on from there, and this was now just a drug withdrawal helped me. Yeah. And then about 18 months ago, I then decided to give up alcohol, which was a big kind of, or 15, 16 months ago, which was a big turning point, because then I could no longer look outside of myself, right?
Yeah.
So that was kind of the last piece in the puzzle, I guess.
Yeah. And it's powerful that you were able to make that distinction that it wasn't you, right? Because it allows us to disassociate in a good way, disassociate from a lot of these symptoms that are taking place, instead of the shame of like, oh no, here I am going back to where I was before. And it allows there to be a shift into a more empowering state too, of like, okay, like this is just the medication, the withdrawal is leaving my body. But I'm somebody who has done so much of this work to this point. You know, I know that I can get through this and that I am healing. And I think that goes to even the conversations we have with ourselves. At this point, did you notice a big shift in the conversations you were having with yourself versus what they were before?
I did. And exactly as you said, I was able to separate from those experiences and those feelings and realize that I am not my feelings, right? I am not my thoughts. I'd done that work. Whereas I think when you're originally in it, you know, I didn't know until I had years of therapy. I thought I was my thoughts. That was just, you know, they were like a part of me. And I think, you know, journaling comes into this so much, because as soon as you put something on paper, the problem becomes outside of you now. Whereas I think we so often try and like overthink things in our head and think we're going to get some clarity by just going over and over in it. Whereas sometimes we're just kind of squeezing juice out of a kind of historical or past thing that we don't want to really embrace anymore. And then we're just redefining our future from our past. And so it's just creating more of the same.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of journaling. It's been a part of my own healing practice for a long time, along with meditation, red light therapy. So I want to jump in and talk a lot about biohacking and energy optimization, because I know there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that are like, okay, Rachel, just tell me what to do to optimize my energy. But you guys, I think it's so important to hear her journey and story, because I also would imagine if you started to do all of those things like right away and you hadn't gone through more so the healing, you did the testing, you changed your nutrition. It wasn't just like a light switch, right? For you, it was something that was a slow process, and your awareness and your thoughts shifted as you were making a lot of these changes. And eventually you stepped into a completely different person, but it was a healing journey. It wasn't just a one thing that you did, is what I'm really gathering and hearing from this story. So, before we do talk about that, though, I'd love for you to speak to the importance of the nervous system and also recovery, because you've talked a lot about recovery and having to shift and focus more on that with where you were for your healing. So why is recovery and managing nervous system important for not just healing, but also for having optimal energy?
It's a great question. I think that, you know, as particularly for like type A personalities, we can utilize other things as crutches just to get through. You know, it's not uncommon for people to, you know, warm up with caffeine and wind down with wine. And that just provides a beginning and an end to the day that's really actually pushing your adrenals quite hard and your liver function and everything else, as you know. And I think that starting to understand your nervous system means that you can protect against burnout. You can see the signs. And I think for me, it's about people embodying the identity really of an athlete. Because if you think of an athlete, they don't just push themselves hard. So they do all the things that if we could do more of, we would see better results, I believe, in our life. So they visualize their long-term success. They see themselves doing the work. They have that grit and determination and self-discipline, but they also really prioritize recovery. All of those things, if you think of an athlete, as much as they're pushing themselves in their training and then in their playing, they're also spending spending lots of time with massage, foam rolling, stretching, physio, meditations, visualizations, all these things that counterbalance the effort that's going out. And I think that when we look at what we're doing, if we use that athlete analogy, we can be overreaching in a functional or a non-functional way. So if we're doing functional overreaching in our lives, then what we're doing is we're creating we're kind of creating a stress, whether that's through pushing ourselves in our work and getting to the next level, or whether it's through physical training or whatever it may be. But it's functional in nature because it's creating an adaptation. What we can have as well is non-functional overreaching, which really just creates a wandering baseline. So this is when you're kind of a little bit underslept, a little bit either underfed or overfed, a little bit overstressed, and nothing's really succeeding that well in any one area, but you feel that you've got to keep juggling all those balls. The issue with that is you're not really making so much progress, and you're also now in that gap between it's easy to fall into what the athlete terminology would be overtraining, and that's our equivalent of burnout. And it's very difficult to come back from. It's much harder to turn that ship around, which is effectively what I had to do. And so I think if we can understand where are we putting our energy, we can decide, are we functionally overreaching and recovering, which will provide adaptations and growth and success, or are we moving into this more sort of non-functional, which leads to that wandering baseline?
Yeah. What are some signs for everyone listening that they may be in that overreaching place, right? So the athlete who's maybe training pretty hard, but there's not like a huge evidence of negativity yet in their life, because I can really take on that analogy as coming from being a bodybuilder and fitness just being such a huge part of my life, with the prioritizing. Why can't it's not coming out okay? Prioritizing, recovery, and even the analogy, right, with bodybuilding at the core, we rebuild our muscles when we're recovering, we break them down during exercise. So if we're only breaking down, and we're not actually giving our body proper recovery and nutrition, what we're actually going to do is catabolize a lot of our muscle tissue. We're going to break that down, and we're actually going to get smaller, which is the opposite of a bodybuilder's goal. Even if they're in a bit of a caloric surplus, that can help, right? Because it's still giving the body some nutrition there. But ultimately, it's those small stressors met with a good amount of recovery that allows the body to build back stronger. So if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I think the kind of things that people might notice is obviously in the training aspect, you're not really progressing. You're not able to lift heavier. You're not able to sprint any faster. You're just seeing a kind of plateau or even a regression in terms of what you're able to do. So at first it might feel like, I'm in my luteal phase, for example, or I'm just really tired. I had a bad night's sleep, but then it sort of goes on. And that persistence is showing that your body's not making those adaptations. And as you were saying, could be in a more kind of catabolic state. I think from outside of that training area and looking at life, I think there is often like an irritability, a feeling in like lower mood, not necessarily depression, but you don't feel that sense of vitality and energy about what you're doing and excitement about the day. You can feel like you get frustrated with things. You can have an inability to concentrate. And then what I find that leads to is kind of a compounding behavior, because you end up then searching for things that are going to give you a quick dopamine hit. Social media, email checking, WhatsApp, that would all be examples of that. But those are cheap forms of dopamine. They're not through things where you've invested some work to get that hit. And so now it kind of wears off extremely quickly. So you need more. And so you start to notice that you can't really concentrate on things. From a physiological perspective, if you were tracking it, you might notice that you're kind of tired but wired. So you're not really getting into deep, restful sleep. Yeah. When I look at sort of Oura Ring data, I often will see in an individual like that their breathing rate's quite rapid. So normally we'd look at seeing kind of a breathing rate overnight, which is when you're in this unconscious state, you're not actively controlling it, of somewhere around sort of 12 or maybe 13 breaths a minute. What I see in individuals who are really pushing that envelope too hard is they might be breathing at 17, 18, 19 breaths per minute. And so their breathing is that much faster. And the issue with that is no matter how much you're doing affirmations, incantations, positive things, reading all these different things, at the end of the day in that situation, position, your body is physiologically communicating to your brain that it's under stress, because that rapid breathing signals that. So you then tend to have higher levels of cortisol. You can get, disruption, as I was saying, with sleep. And then we notice that a metric known as heart rate variability can go down. And so if you are a type A personality and you feel like, well, what's the difference? Like, how would I know that I don't just need to get my ass off the sofa and put some grit and go and work out or do the things? Like, how can I objectively know this? Then you can monitor what's known as heart rate variability. And that's the interbeat variability. So the heart isn't designed to beat like a metronome. If we had an average pulse of 60 beats a minute, it wouldn't be 1 beat per second. There's significant interbeat variability, and everyone's heart rate variability is different. It's partly determined by genetics, partly by lifestyle, and partly by age. It's kind of almost a third, if you like. And so we don't want to compare it with anyone else's, but once we have a baseline, we can then look at that and establish, are we starting to drop? And if we see a depression in HRV of about 20%, we know there's not enough recovery. And certainly 40%, you've got to really dial things back. So you want to avoid getting there. But when I work with clients in my programs, what we do is we use an ECG device, because this allows us to take measurements over a period of days where you can start to understand what's happening during the day. Because a lot of people feel like, oh, well, that's great. I saw, on my Oura ring last night that my HRV was lower and I didn't have great sleep, and my body temperature was a bit higher, or my breathing rate. But they don't really understand how they ended up there and what behaviors were causing that, if you like. Whereas when we can take some assessments of anywhere between 24 hours and 5 days, we can start to understand how your days are informing your nights. And what we can actually track is, what's the intensity and duration of recovery that you're getting during the night? Are you actually going into the red at night where you're very sympathetically engaged? And how is what you're doing during the day mirroring the nights? And how can we make changes in our conscious state during the day to actually set up enhanced recovery? So that's a kind of really powerful way to start to control it.
I know for a lot of my listeners, they're like, okay, awesome. Some data as a way to like see if they're experiencing any of those signs. So this is something people wear during the day. I know the Oura Ring is something that you wear all the time, but it mainly monitors a lot of your sleep cycles, and then HRV at nighttime. But you're speaking to having people wear a heart rate monitor during the day to see maybe when they're more so experiencing rapid breaths or sympathetic activity.
Yeah, so we use, there's a few different devices you can use. The one that we use is a device called First Beat. It's a bodyguard. So it's like a small strap that comes with electrodes across the chest. You can't see it under clothing. And that gives the client their data on an app on the phone, so they can see it live data. But when they close out the assessment, it will come into the practitioner portal. And at that point, we can kind of analyze what's been going on. And you'll get a stress score alongside a recovery score. And so you'd be able to see, for example, like that early morning workout, how was that then impacting your day? And did you need more recovery? How was that meeting? How was it when you took the kids to school and it was mental and you were going to be late and they're all arguing in the car? You can actually see, and you can tag those events. And what we found is a couple of things. By introducing micro recoveries during the day, that can really help to manage your nervous system and enhance better sleep. So we all know about things like going and getting access to early morning light and aligning with our circadian rhythm and not eating too late. And all those things are incredible. But also, if you start to introduce like 1 to 2 minutes of breath work, for example, during the day, just to bring yourself back into your kind of resonant frequency, that can be really helpful. Thinking about your thoughts, journaling, and you'll see yourself go into the green. So these activities can make a profound difference on that overall recovery and ultimately your capacity.
Yeah. So instead of just doing these things in the morning and then end of the day, actually adding in micro recoveries during the day.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can start to see, well, where is my most highly stressed point of the day? How can I either attenuate that or even avoid it by introducing micro recoveries and grant myself some grace? And that leads ultimately to better performance.
I love that you're speaking to that because I feel like this was something I learned in this last year for me. Because I was like, I am always having a good morning routine. I have that like dialed in. I do my red light, I do a little bit of an ice bath in the morning, which is still a stressor on the body. I do my workout, I do meditation, I do all of that. And I'll like step into my day being like, all right, like I feel awesome. I make sure I eat before I have coffee. And then I would have a good evening time wind down, but I would always get that midday slump where I'd like just feel kind of fatigued and tired. And I used to have like type A brain of the mentality of, okay, just like work through my lunches and not really take a whole lot of breaks. So then I'd get to 5 o'clock and I'd be like, man, I am exhausted now at this point. So I remember one day I took, I decided to put on my bikini and I did like a quick little ice bath jump in, not like a ice bath, but just like cool down because it's 110 degrees in Texas. And then I laid out on in my backyard in the sun for about a good 30 minutes. I put on some meditation music. And then, I went back into my day after that with consults and calls that I had, but my entire rest of my day was shift with my nervous system and my energy. And I was like, man, this 30-minute period actually allowed me to be more productive and have better energy where I didn't get to 5 o'clock PM and I was just exhausted and burnt out. And ever since that one day, it was like that one win that I got. It's now a ritual that every single lunch break that I have is I'm outside, I'm in the sun, I'm typically in my bikini, if not naked, in the backyard, soaking up the sun. And it's like the best thing that I could ever do, like better than any cup of coffee. So it resonates with me.
It's amazing.
Speaking to like the micro little recoveries during the day.
And I love what you said there that, that investment of your time just paid back so many dividends. Because I think it's easy to assume I'm too busy for this, I don't have time. You're actually going to get time back.
Yeah, exactly. So what is BioSyncing? I know that's something you speak to quite a bit, and I'd love the listeners to hear more about that.
So BioSyncing is something that I created where I think when I was going through my own journey and looking at biohacking, it all just felt like quite masculine in nature and didn't involve so much sort of intuition, if you like. And so BioSyncing is really it's still about biooptimization, but it's about syncing with your physiology. So your female physiology in terms of either your menstrual cycle or wherever you are in that stage, right? It could be perimenopause or postmenopause, and kind of getting things to line up in that way in terms of your nutrition and your workouts, but also syncing with your future self and really stepping into that most empowered version of you and creating that identity. Because that was a big part of my own journey, was figuring out, who do I really want to be? Like, how do I want to show up as a mother to my children? How do I want to show up in my business? How do I want to serve other people? And so it's syncing those things alongside syncing your nervous system, like we've already spoken about, which helps you have more capacity, more flow, more calm. And also just syncing with nature's laws, which makes everything easier, right? When we're not trying to fight against things.
Yeah. How does somebody do BioSyncing? I don't know if that's the right question I'm asking.
As in, how do they start BioSyncing?
Yeah. How do they start BioSyncing?
So they can start BioSyncing by really understanding what works for them. So like, for example, if we look at how do you sync with your circadian rhythm, you probably have a fair idea of whether you're an early morning person or a night owl or somewhere in the middle. And, as a lawyer, I was working all night and it didn't matter how early I got in. I'm a really early morning person, but no matter how early I got into that law firm, I was going to be there late. So I realized over time it was futile, but I was really out of sync with my own circadian alignment. And that makes a big difference. And you can see that on apps like Aura. Did you sync your sleep with your chronotype? And is the midpoint of your sleep cycle in the midpoint of that? So you can track it. You can sync your nutrition around your menstrual cycle and your workouts, but also syncing with your personal goals. And they're going to be different. And there are seasons in life. So, what you might be doing if you are a mum who's just had a couple of kids, for example, and you're really busy and you don't have lots of energy, you might be doing kind of shorter workouts. You might be focusing more on your family and raising them, contrasted to someone whose children have grown up and left home and they have much more time for themselves and their businesses and things like that. So I think it's about syncing with really you, who you truly are, and doing, different testing and things if it's within your budget. to actually find out things like your genetics, your blood work, and syncing your nutrition and what you do around that. But also the nervous system, I think, is probably one of the most important pieces alongside the mindset, because we really want to step into that version of ourselves that achieves everything we want. And it's something it's almost a forgotten skill, right? I was looking at my daughter the other day in the car, and she's had her headphones on, she's listening to music, and she just looked really dreamy. And I thought she'd fallen asleep. And she was like, no, I was just visualizing this thing that she was doing. Mm-hmm. And, we used to do that as kids in the car. And I think as adults, we forget that we can consciously create what we want.
Yeah. And a lot of that's through, do you feel visualization? Like it's almost kind of like not make believe, but I hear what you're saying with like kiddos where, they will step into their dreams, they'll think about it, they'll close their eyes and they'll actually put themselves currently in that state of them experiencing all of life's bliss and dreaming of them being a superhero and flying or whatever it may be. And it's almost like we've lost sight of that as adults. Like we stop dreaming, but we also stop putting ourselves in those positive places too, like in our mind. And we almost shift and put ourselves more in these negative places. Like we think about all the things that we have to do, we don't want to do. It's very much fear focused instead of consciously putting ourselves, like what you said, future self. How do I want to show up? How do I want to feel every single day? How am I going to add energy to other people? What does that actually look like? What am I doing? How do I feel? And putting ourselves consciously in that energy state. Is that what you're speaking to?
Yeah, very much so. And I think if not, what we end up doing is creating around our beliefs that we've been conditioned, right? And things that have happened in our past and not believing that we can create a different future. But if you look back and think of yourself 10 years ago, you're a different person than you are now. And yet many people will expect that in 10 years' time, they're just going to be themselves now, but older. That's not the case at all. But if we don't want to kind of live according to other people's values, then we need to get really clear on what ours are. And if we start to sync our goals and our dreams, and we make sure we're living in alignment with our values, then we can consciously create our life and step into that most empowered version of ourselves. And we can create from the future, because there's a lot of future self psychology now. Dr. Benjamin Hardy writes a lot about this, and others around how when we create from our future self, we're bringing that into the present, and that's how we manifest our future, as opposed to letting the past define the present. You can actually use the present to reframe the past, because really the past is only there to serve you in terms of its lessons. It doesn't exist anymore. And so it shouldn't hold so much power over your future.
Say that one more time. When we create from our future selves, because that was really powerful.
Yeah, when we create from our future selves, that's when we can consciously control more of the present moment attention to create the future that we want. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of like thinking, and that's effectively what kids do. That's what athletes do, is they're visualizing that result and they're visualizing themselves do the work. And then they're bringing that person into the present moment to consciously create their reality. It's too easy to look back at the past and think that I can't change these things, and that's how they are. But actually, it's not based in reality.
Yeah, that's just so powerful for everybody to hear, because we are often creating from our past selves, right? We're creating based off of, our history, our memories of what we know has been the outcomes previously, but we're not actually creating from our future selves, which is where we consciously control and create the futures that we want. And we also create it right here, right now, right? Because our energy and our vibration shifts when we put ourselves in the state of how we want to actually feel and show up in our dreams. So I just thought that was so powerful. And I haven't heard a whole lot of people speak to syncing in terms of future self. I've heard a lot of syncing, right? Syncing with your menstrual cycle, syncing with your nutrition, circadian rhythm, like all of those things are incredibly important. And what's even most important though, is really syncing, I think, with your nervous system and the version of yourself you want to be. I know the brain really doesn't know the difference often between something that is happening right here, right now, versus something that we are thinking about or dreaming about. So one of the best things we can do to even shift our nervous system is to put ourselves in a place of gratitude, of joy, of bliss, of excitement. Because very often if you are maybe really stressed out and you are thinking about all the things that stress you out and all the things that you don't want to happen, the body is going to respond. It's going to shorten its breath. It's going to put you in a sympathetic state. Cortisol is going to spike, versus you could be experiencing some things that are stressful, but if the view of these things are not necessarily so focused on what's wrong and the stressor itself, but more so focused on how this is maybe even making you better, focusing on how you want to show up in these events, it actually can calm the nervous system and put you more in that sympathetic state. So I think it's so powerful that you speak to syncing not only just nutrition and circadian rhythm, but also speaking to the future self.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's the most important, like, I guess probably the most important thing, because it's really what is driving us forward. And that's then, as you were saying, like, we can create our beliefs that we want them to be, because when we think of it, like, our conscious mind is kind of the goal setter, but it's our unconscious mind that is the goal getter. And so we have to have those two things marry up. And it's through that visualization and stepping into that identity and thinking about that identity is going to be different, right? You know, the identity that I want to have as a coach who impacts and serves women is different to the identity I want to have as a mother to my children. And when you become really intentional about that and you create that space through things like breath work, when you make transitions between one scenario and another, you allow yourself space to step into that identity and be truly present, rather than bringing kind of residue energy from one situation to another. And then we kind of haven't really defined who we want to be. And I think that in itself can be really powerful of helping us really be truly present and truly in sync, as I would say, with the person we want to show up as.
Yeah. If I'm somebody who's listening to this podcast and maybe I'm fatigued, I'm struggling with burnout in my life, maybe it's from my work, or I'm a mama and I'm just raising a bunch of kids, what piece of advice would you give that person?
I would say don't fall into the criticism trap of, Tony Robbins talks about the fact that we got to stop shitting all over ourselves, right? And I think that is so easy in that situation to say, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. Just be kind to yourself. This is a season in your life and it's going to change, and it's going to change really quickly. And those tiny little bundles that just love you unconditionally are going to grow up. And if you can just enjoy each stage for what it is and give yourself that space, I think actually you can get whatever it is that you're looking for results in much faster. But just really show kindness and love to yourself, because it kind of starts and ends with you. Yeah,
I love that. More kindness, love, and ease and grace in everything that we do. We're so hard on ourselves. That's really where a lot of those shoulds come from, is we feel like we have to do all of these things. And if we don't, like the world's going to end, we're not going to be good enough. We're not going to be lovable enough. And at the core, it's all really a lie. So I love that you bring in more kindness and grace, not just to other people, but to yourself. And I think, we tend to focus often on how can we be more kind and generous to other people, but not so much of how can we really show up more in that for ourselves. So this has been a very powerful conversation. I love talking all about like biohacking and biosynching, and even hearing a lot of your own healing story. And I appreciate you being so vulnerable and speaking to it. I can tell that you're very, very genuine in everything that you're speaking to. Like, you've walked through it. You've been where so many women are at. And I think that's so powerful, because women are able to really resonate with that, right? They'll be like, okay, this woman, she gets it. She's been where I'm at, but she's came out on the other side. And that's just such a beautiful hope for so many people who are listening, who are in burnout or fatigue, and really hearing the work that you had to do, because it wasn't easy. I would imagine it was a lot of work, in this, but it's always so worth it. And the version of yourself that you get to become. So thank you. Thank you for coming on my podcast here today. Where can people follow you and learn more about your work and how to work with you even?
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you for having me on, and I'd say as a kind of last thing for anyone listening, if you don't kind of have that self-belief yet, just borrow that belief from me. Because if I can go from being burnt out and, washing down antipsychotics at night with a few glasses of wine just to be able to fall asleep and my toddler dragging me out of bed and heal myself and come on this journey, then I know that you can too. And so grant yourself that grace. Where can people connect? You can connect with me on Instagram at Angela S. Foster. My podcast you mentioned is High Performance Health. I'm hoping you're going to come on, Rachel, and we can chat on there too. And then if people want to get just a snapshot of their health and where they are now, I have this kind of shift protocol for health optimization. If you go to yourtotalhealthcheck.com, you can take a free quiz, take you about 60 seconds, and we'll give you scores in every area: sleep, hormones, the insights you're tracking, the way you're fueling your body and training your body and mind. And we'll send you a free personalized report.
Awesome. We'll make sure we definitely put that in the show notes, yourtotalhealthcheck.com, and all of your social media and website. So thank you for coming on, Angela. And I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. And do me a favor, if you did, leave us a 5-star review. Let me know what you loved about today's episode. Take a screenshot, share it in your stories, tag Angela on Instagram, tag Rachel Scheer, the Scheer Madness Podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you.